Good afternoon. Hi, good afternoon. Welcome. Welcome to the panel on climate change. It's a good segue for the panel that we just had. I'm Gustavo Faleiros. I'm a Brazilian journalist working as director for environmental investigations for the Pulitzer Center. I have great colleagues here with me today, Erin and Emilia. I will introduce you pretty soon. I want to start by thanking IMAD for this great invitation to curate this panel on an issue that we all know it's very important. We are grateful to have this opportunity to discuss climate change. Today we're going to have a nice conversation. We thought not about doing presentations, but actually having a dialogue, looking at the issue of how the mainstream media, the big outlets, global media outlets are dealing with and covering climate change, which I believe, like me, you think it's one of the biggest stories of our times. I think also the fact that we are in Greece recently, where we had such a big extreme events, weather events, also makes this panel very relevant. And as I was saying, as the speakers, we have two very experienced, extraordinary journalists with a very diverse background. So here on my left, first, Erin Baker. She's a senior climate correspondent and environmental correspondent for Time magazine. She's been covering things in several continents, has been working as a bureau chief in Africa, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, among many other things. Recently, she also joined an initiative is called the Ocean Reporting Network, which is hosted by the Pulitzer Center. And my far left, we have Emilia Mikasuk, who is the climate editor of Financial Times, also with a long career on working in different continents. She works in America for Financial Times, also in London in other capacities, and she had a previous career also working in outlets in Australia. So as you can see, a very diverse and experience for us to discuss the climate issue. I just want to start setting some ground for the discussion here, remembering you why it's important for us as journalists to discuss the complexity of doing the coverage of climate change. In our experiences here, we've been discussing before coming to Greece, the complexity of doing something that demands us to be very engaging to the audiences, right? Like we have to explain very well the scientific facts, and at the same time dealing with issues that are, as I was saying, like complex in science, or dealing with data, being very rigorous, interviewing authorities and scientists. So it is an issue that I would say demands at the same time the capacity of storytelling, and at the same time being an expert on scientific facts. Certainly the audience is concerned about this. If you probably remember, there was some recent research by the Reuters Institute based in Oxford showing that there is an interest in various markets. Most of the markets that they research show that at least 50% of the media consumers are concerned about climate change. They are interested in the news, but at the same time, there's I think a challenge for us that when you ask the same consumers what climate news causes, you see that there's a lot of sadness and anxiety involved on consuming climate news, and there's also like a hypothesis that the same feelings are causing some kind of a news avoidance. So some of the things that we're going to discuss here is exactly how to avoid audiences to running away from our news. And so the last thing that I want to mention is that what I'm going to start discussing here is the scenario in the media itself. As I was mentioning, both Time and Financial Times has created this climate desk, has assigned reporters to do special stories about climate, but so is the same for other big and important media outlets. So we have climate desks in the New York Times, AP has created a climate desk with reporters in several countries, and just by coincidence, I was reading that LA Times has announced a climate desk yesterday. So it's becoming a trend, or it is a trend already in the media landscape. So this is where I would like to start, asking you, why do you think the Time magazine and the Financial Times decided to create a climate desk? There was environmental desks years ago, and things have changed, and now we're calling them climate desk. Why do you think is that the case at this point?
Go ahead. I think Time started because climate, while it is a cross-newsroom story, it requires expertise in economics and science in on-the-ground reporting. So we needed a team that could actually combine all of those. While tapping the rest of the newsroom, you needed to have a place where you could centralize it and think about how we're going to tell that story in the Time voice in a way that reaches our audience that isn't just siloed into, say, political reporting or economics.
So at the Financial Times, thank you all for being here. In January 2020, we had a new editor start, Rula Khalaf, the first female editor. We'd had, as you say, an environment correspondent for many years, actually, usually someone very senior and experienced on the newspaper. But our coverage was starting to become fragmented, so many different reporters across different jurisdictions, different sectors began to write about climate change. And some of them felt confident to do that, and some of them did not feel so confident. And she felt that our coverage was, as I say, getting quite fragmented, and she wanted to unify it in a way. So, but she also didn't want it to become a silo. And in one of my previous roles, I was a digital editor, and it reminds me very much of what was happening in digital journalism, where there were these divides, and some people were interested and some people not so interested. So as you get a coalescing or a coalition of people who are interested, you need to sort of manage that, I suppose. So that's my job as the climate editor. But we have what we call, so I call it a floating desk, so I work with other desks. So I'm not just standalone, so I will talk to them. We have a foreign editor, we have companies editors, we have quite a lot of different editors. So I'm across all of them, including data editors, video editors, audio. So it's a unifying principle that we're trying to bring to the subject, because as Aaron says, it's complicated and cross-disciplinary, so you need to reflect that. And there are not very many other areas like this. The only other one similar in the Financial Times is tech. So tech desk, but actually the experience on the tech desk was it was set up with its own structure. It is more siloed, and they would wish it not to be. They would rather it was more cross-border, but it's kind of got a legacy issue.
Very interesting. I like the concept of the floating desk, and these arrangements. What is the agenda? What are the main topics? How you identify a topic, a climate topic, without stepping on somebody's area? How you decide your priorities and how to assign a reporter? Can you, maybe we hear from you, Emilia, then, yeah.
Yeah, the Financial Times generally is quite bottom-up driven, so a lot of ideas are percolating from below. And as I say, it's really about managing those ideas and coordinating between reporters who have different expertise. So again, that's kind of where I come in. And so the agenda is partly set by what I'm filtering up from them coming below. They're really telling me this is what they're hearing in the corridors, or this is what their companies, you know, if you're the heavy industry reporter, this is what you're hearing from their companies. And I try and match them with the climate reporters so that they have some dialogue. And so at the moment, the themes, of course, we have the UN Conference of the Parties coming up in Dubai. So we spend a lot of time talking about that UN aspect. This year in particular, there's been a lot of push and pull between, which everybody sees, whether it's debate about coal or about fossil fuels generally. This year it's become much more of an arm wrestle about these issues, much more of a struggle. And so we're trying to reflect that in a thoughtful way that is, you know, neutral, I guess, is not taking any sides. But reporting, more recently we've been doing a lot more reporting about what the oil and gas industry is doing in a quite active pushback, is what I would say. Much more stark than ever before. They're taking advantage of the the energy crisis to do that. So, we're exploring those sorts of themes at the moment.
Very interesting. It brings also like the need of expertise of investigation, which it's pretty much your expertise, right, Aaron? Like you've been doing investigations for so long and in different parts. Like so how you identify stories to dedicate to it?
Well, I think one thing, Time magazine, at least on the magazine side, is a little bit more slow journalism. We have a little bit more time. It's not breaking news. So what my approach and the rest of my team is we call it climate is everything. So it's about taking kind of the bigger news story and finding the climate angle rather than telling the climate story straightforward. So I look at it as a challenge to find the climate thread in a story, but tell it in an engaging narrative or feature style so that it's not going to just draw an audience that's interested in climate stories, but an audience that's interested in India or in labor rights or whatever the subject at hand may be. I'm trying to get as big an audience as possible and explain the story in a way that makes sense rather than just pure climate science.
And you've done this recently with a cover about oceans. Really recommend you take a look on this story about the relationship between oceans and climate. But here's one debate that we have, a long debate that we have before this panel, which I think is going to be interesting for everybody. So we have some outlets taking an editorial decision, and namely The Guardian made a decision of calling not more climate change, but climate emergency, and that was a big thing. And we discussed this, and both outlets, they use these expressions, climate crisis, climate emergence, with a lot of care. So it's not all the time you're using climate crisis. So I would like you to bring these perspectives as well. Why not using climate crisis all the time, Emilia?
So for our audience, we had a big discussion amongst the editors, and there was a sense that if you use the word crisis, like great financial crisis or other crises that we have written about, that it suggests migrant crisis. It suggests that there's a solution, that you can answer that crisis. You have a pandemic crisis, you come up with vaccines, that it can be resolved quickly. And so we felt that by calling it climate change and being quite neutral, or global warming, or it was not only more accurate, but it conveys the sense of there's this big systemic shift, planetary shift, literally, going on that we want to describe.
We don't have a straightforward newsroom policy on which terms we use. It is up to the individual correspondent. But I think we all agree that a lot of it depends on context. Also, is this a short web story or is this a feature in the magazine? That's going to shape the decisions we use. So there have been times where I've used the term climate crisis, but it's usually when I'm talking about a very short-term or quick solution. It's in a specific context, whereas climate change is an ongoing thematic term that I use for my bigger stories or my reported features. But I also think that readers make a difference too. Climate crisis, by talking to a couple of younger audiences or older audiences, climate crisis can be alienating. It can be anxiety-inducing. So we also have to be conscious of the impact that we're having on our readers and what the response we want to elicit. So that's another reason why you would choose one over the other, climate emergency, if you're talking about what happened in the UNGA. So I think it's very contextual.
It's interesting to me, for example, that the UN Secretary General has been increasing his rhetoric over these last few years as we have more evidence of, the hottest year, the hottest summer, and he's now calling it global boiling. So, it's effective for him in his communication, but he's trying to communicate some urgency to this problem, but I'm not sure in the media where that sits.
Yeah, and another thing that it caught my attention that Gutierrez, the Secretary General, talks of like we opened the doors from hell. It was like it's quite pessimistic in a way. But another aspect of this,
I think he might need therapy.
well, he's in a difficult position. Let's give him a credit. Yeah. But another aspect of this is what Aaron was just saying, like how I think the one fascinating thing about this moment, is to give voice or interview and cover the civil rights or the civil society movements, and especially the youth. So I was really interested to learn on how are you framing or covering the, like the Gretas of the world, like the young movements of like doing, like hunger strikes or like climate strikes? Is that let's say a public that you're trying to depict and cover as well, like this civil movements?
So generally speaking, FT audience is people in positions of power, decision makers, and also people within organizations. So we're writing for them. So we tend to write about the movements if they, in a way that's relevant to them. So if it's disruptive to them or otherwise, or if it's a big statement. I was saying earlier, I went to the march in New York Climate Week last week, and I was very interested that it was targeting companies directly, targeting Citigroup, targeting the fossil fuel companies. And so that's something that we would report because, if you work for these companies or you run these companies, that's something you should be paying attention to. So that tends to be our way of covering it. If there's a protest that is disrupting which has happened quite constantly in the City of London, the insurance companies or the banks, then that's our way of covering those protests. And also I use that word carefully because I think with all of our language, as we're talking about language, I'm careful about whether we call people protesters or demonstrators or campaigners or activists. It's very easy on both sides of the discussion. When I say sides, there's no side. We're all for the planet. But it's very easy to mischaracterize the climate movement. And the movement itself has something to answer for by making it a fight, instead of it's a fight, but I always think by politicizing it, it's made it much more difficult to have a conversation about it. Leaving that, there's another whole topic, but so with the language of describing the demonstrations and the campaigns, I'm very careful about that. So if they're climate scientists, then we say they're scientists. If they're campaigners, we say, who were they funded by? What is the group that is doing the campaigning?
I think at time we want to look at impact. We did put Greta on the Person of the Year 2 years ago. We've covered the Sunrise Movement in not as a profile, but how they impact the political campaigns. We also asked the question, instead of just looking or covering the latest art protest or soup at the museum or the tennis matches, we asked, what is the impact? How is it actually reading across the audience that's seeing it or has been disrupted at a museum or a tennis match? So I think we're going to look at the bigger question, how does it work? Does it have impact or is it alienating people? I think these are the kind of questions we're more interested in rather than just the newsmakers themselves.
And looking at the other side of the equation, if you like, how to cover the bureaucracy around the climate negotiations. So one big event of every year is this climate negotiations that we call the Conference of the Parties, that we will have another one in December in Dubai, where all governments go and they decide on the, the targets and the review of the Paris Agreement and everything. And that's covering some of them myself. It's pretty boring, to be fair, and it's difficult to get stories out of this. So how to, to cover those conferences and what we can extract from them in terms of,
Yeah, I mean, as you say, they are difficult to cover, but unfortunately, when you are trying to get the bureaucracy of the world of 200 countries to come together to make a common decision for common purpose, it involves quite a lot of drudgery and this kind of difficult negotiation that they go through. So for us, the most challenging thing is to capture what is going on in those negotiating rooms. And I guess the way we do that is we talk to people quite a lot in the lead up, as many negotiating teams as possible, to get as much of a sense of where the direction of the discussion and negotiations are going. Unfortunately, they haven't gone very far in the last few years. And last year we were, I think I was saying, literally running from one country negotiating team to another negotiating team to another to try and get a picture of what was going on. So, for example, 8 a.m. on Saturday morning, on the second last day of the talks last year, the EU Commissioner responsible for climate change had an impromptu press conference. I don't know how many people were there. We happened to get there just at 8 a.m. to the media centre, and he said, that's it, we're going to walk away. That would have been a really huge thing. It was a negotiating tactic, obviously. So we had to be careful. Do we say EU, walks out of talks? Ultimately, they did not, because they do not want to blow up the process to that degree. But it makes it it's a challenging reporting exercise, I have to say.
And sorry, just a follow-up. Do you see your audience such a, like a niche audience of like the Financial Times? Do they get really interested and they follow, they comment? How is the reaction of your audience to this coverage?
Yeah, those negotiations and COP itself and other multilateral bodies, for want of better description, like the World Bank, the IMF, actually our audience is that's some of our biggest traffic is for those stories. These organisations touch quite a lot of people, they affect a lot of people, there are a lot of participants both inside those organisations and dealing with them, and they are very engaged.
Do you want to comment on the COP coverage, Erin? You've been in some and you're preparing to go to the next one.
I am. I can't say it's my favorite thing to cover by a long shot, but we are a very small team. We're 3 people, and we also have to think about bang for the climate buck or the carbon buck. I mean, it's a long distance to fly for us. So we think more about what's the story, how do we analyze the outcome, how do we make it relevant? So instead of doing the minute-by-minute negotiations, we're going to look at the bigger picture, and we're going to bring that home to our audience. Because I think in the end, that's what our audience, which is not a very specialized or financial audience, it's much more general. That's what they want. They want to know, what does this mean for me? Why is it important? And what's my takeaway? So that's how we approach it. And usually we only send one person.
Speaking of which, I would like to ask you, like, how do you prepare, or how do you think a reporter should prepare to cover the climate? A very common tip that we get, like, you have to humanize the story, give it a human face, like bring these stories, but sometimes it's just not easy, or you're just generalizing, let's say, a natural disaster and picturing it as a climate disaster. So coming to the point that is a very complex issue to cover. So maybe you have an advice, but I would like to ask you, like, how do you prepare, and how do you think a reporter should prepare to be a climate reporter? You want to start, Erin or Emily?
Read a lot. I don't know, like, yes, I always feel like you have to find a character, you have to make it relevant. And I always think about, for me, as a journalist, this is, like, I think about, what is my mom, who's a retired school teacher in California, what does she care about? How do I make it relevant to her? So if I can't find a character in a story, say about, the politics of plastic negotiations, what does make her care? So I'm constantly posing this question to myself. Is it the health aspect? And if all else fails, I make it about myself. Not for my mom, she will read anything I write. But in general, I feel like a reader can relate to me. So if I start talking about plastics negotiations, and I struggle to find a character or some way to tell the story that's interesting, I talk about my own struggles with consuming plastics or trying to stop. And that is another way to bring an audience in. But it's essential for a lay magazine like ourselves to really engage. And I think that has to be the priority. There's no point in writing a story if somebody's not going to read it.
It's definitely true. I guess, so I had a very steep learning curve myself 3 years ago. I thought I knew about most of the issues, but actually climate is, particularly for the Financial Times, if you're looking at the carbon markets, for example, carbon pricing, taxes, these quite complex areas in themselves, and you try and marry that with the real world effect that's going on, the sort of intangible and the tangible change constantly. So I usually rely on sort of reminding the reporters, as deep in the weeds as they are going on some of these subjects and rules and regulations and arguments, that it's really about what's going on in a tangible sense out there. And actually that's missing from a lot of coverage, even the coverage that, just broadly speaking, not us of course, but broadly speaking, you will see a story. I was looking last night at TV here, the news about the floods that are taking place currently in the north. Very little discussion about climate change is mentioned in passing, but very little discussion about sort of the trajectory, the science. So that, I would say, for me, the most useful thing that I did was try to understand the basic science and basic physics. And that is not that complicated. And once you have that framework, then it's much easier to bring that to all of your reporting or your editing, whatever, or your newsroom role, whatever that is. So, and scientists are very neglected. They love to talk, they love to explain, they're very good teachers about their subject. They're much more interesting to talk to than financial experts, I can say that. One thing I find with climate change sourcing and coverage generally is that more than even when I learnt about financial markets, it's full of jargon. So you have to become familiar with the jargon so you can break it down. Like everything else where there is jargon, there is no more jargon in any other discipline. I've been involved in 3 decades of journalism than in climate, and I don't really understand that. It's like the experts want to hold the knowledge to themselves by creating these forever new terms, So master the science, master the jargon. It's out there, it's happening. So, yeah.
I have one other thing to add to that. I think it's also easy to get so immersed in the science that I start making the mistake of assuming that everybody else knows. So what I've started doing more recently is I sit down before I embark on a story and I write down what I know and what I don't know about a story, and I ask a couple of questions. And so after now 6 months I've been in one subject or another, I go back and I look at those questions and I realize if I didn't know and I'm pretty immersed in this, nobody else knows. So I have to go back and remind myself.
Such a good tip. That's such a common error. Once we understand, we assume that everybody understood as well. So we'll open to questions. You start preparing. I think I'll make one final question before I jump. Well, I can start, and I have more. I was afraid that we won't have questions, but Momi, please, the microphone here. I'm glad that we are ready to start. Can someone help us with the microphone? Here it comes from the skies, descending. So for every question, as usual, I will ask you to introduce yourself and be brief.
Yes, I'm Momi Peralta from La Nación in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and we work in the data team, and we are doing that intensive, trying to be proactive, studying the science. And the question is, have you implemented some training, basic training, or how do you transfer this knowledge or basic of climate literacy? This is one question. The other is about biodiversity, if it is also in your agenda of climate.
So yes, when I started, we held a masterclass for all of the reporters and editors, virtual masterclass, so anybody could join and ask questions we had three people, myself as the editor, the lead climate correspondent, and a long-term environment writer and commentator of the paper answering these questions. That's been videoed, and now it's available as a resource on our intranet. So that was the first bit of training. The second thing we did was we created a climate game with our data visualization team, and it took quite a long time, it took 6 months. It's based on you are the leader of the world, these are the choices you have to make, and we take you through scenarios. It's based on some data that we collected from the IEA, from the agency. So that's a free, open-sourced climate game. We take our role seriously in delivering this information, breaking down information, and that was one way that we did it. And so we encourage people internally to play it. I think the first people to see the game, the beta version, was our board. Our editor took the game to a board meeting and said, can you play the game? And the game means that can you make choices that will keep the temperature rise under 1.5 degrees, and then you tweet your results. So that was a good learning exercise using data. We also have data visualization and graphics team It's quite large, it's 40 people, they're not all doing climate, but 2 of those people are focused on climate data, and so and we have a climate newsletter every week where they explain where they got the data from for their graphics, and how you can get it, and how you can follow the data, and how you can make charts. So it's both an external and internal process. Very long-winded answer, but it's an important thing, the spreading of this knowledge. We also have a jargon buster on site, which I have to tell you started because I started to write down all these jargon terms for myself, and while I was typing them out, I thought, oh, I can publish this as A to Z, and I keep adding to it with all sorts of new nonsense that companies come up with. Biodiversity, yes, it is on our agenda. It is following the fact that it is on the agenda of the companies and organisations that we cover, because standards are starting to be put in place, or there's debate going on at organisations about how to account for their destruction of nature, or how to account for the value of nature. And this discussion about the economic value of nature is part of what we cover.
We have a quite small newsroom, so we don't really have the facilities for doing that kind of training, but fortunately there exist many organizations like IMED, like the Pulitzer Center, that has offered, and I've been able to take advantage of Pulitzer Center's trainings over the years, and that's been a huge resource. I think we need to start seeing more of that kind of training, because newsrooms do not always have that facility. We're not as big as the FT. So to be able to get external sources of that, I think, is an important thing going forward. So any donors, paying attention, that's where we should put our money. And as far as biodiversity is concerned, that's generally my beat, and I consider it an essential part of climate reporting because, the oceans, for example, are a huge source of carbon sequestration. Without the oceans, you don't have carbon sequestration. So I think that link is oftentimes overlooked, but I hope that we'll start seeing more and more of those links made going forward, especially after the new protocols are in place.
I would also add that another way that I learned was I started watching conferences. So much of the virtual world is available to us of knowledge, and even, I've never been to Davos, but they get some really great panelists and experts and people talking about these things. The videos are still there. I watched quite a lot of those to learn myself, and they had scientists do some of the world's experts of tipping points, and really very thoughtful, very expensive, beautiful presentations. They're all excellent learning opportunities. There's lots of free streamed information.
One more question here. Okay, so we have 1, 2, 3. Go.
Hello, I have a couple questions. The first one is that with a lot of the articles and stuff that are published and everything, it's very important information, but sometimes it can get a little bleak and feel a little hopeless, personally. So how do you guys keep the faith in that reporting and talking about it will actually affect change? And then additionally, I'm a university student that's studying public policy. So I was wondering what policies or what you wish policymakers would take away from your reporting.
Can you identify yourself just for us to know? Have you
What?
Identify.
Oh, my name's Jenna DeMeo from the University of Delaware.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to?
So Time for the last couple of years has been very much focused on what they call solutions journalism, and this is becoming more and more a common term used in newsrooms in general. Time has always been allergic to what they call pointing at the problem. You have to offer not the solution, but opportunities for solutions. Also, there's this idea that you also have to examine and investigate those solutions. Do they work? Do they not work? Are they facile? Are they long-term? So I think that is an increasingly important part of climate journalism, is to not just say we're doomed and throw up our hands in despair, but rather here are potentials for your activism, for corporate activism, for policy change, or also just technological solutions, or why those technological solutions may not work. I think these are all important aspects of climate reporting going forward.
I guess we focus quite a lot on the role of governments and what governments are, and therefore democracies are doing. And on a day-to-day basis, there's a lot of discussion and negotiation about regulations and standards. And these things are kind of boring, but actually they're really important. And once some of these governments act, my own birth country, Australia, has had a real shift since the Conference of the Parties in Glasgow. I was embarrassed to be an Australian because Australia was in the same category as Russia and, terrible regimes really that, although it was a democracy, but happily there was an election and the whole policy argument has completely shifted there. So we do focus quite a lot on that, and also, as I've said, financial market policy, financial regulation. What are the regulators doing? How are they imposing costs, on companies? So companies are making quite a lot of profits. What's the cost of their pollution? What's the cost of the way they do business? How are they dealing with those costs? So that money and government standards, regulation, lever, they're the two levers that we pull on quite a lot. And I guess we're not really so much looking for solutions. We're saying, look here, this is the problem, and governments and business need to act. I mean, it's much more sort of pressure tactics, I suppose.
One question here.
Thanks very much for this. My name is Ben Horton. I work at Chatham House. It's been a real fascinating panel. Thanks so much for all of the perspectives. I just wanted to pick up something a little more on this tone point, I suppose, because we've heard, the challenges of confronting this issue in a neutral way, the dangers of sort of anxiety-inducing language around crisis. But I just wanted to kind of maybe play devil's advocate a bit on that and just sort of say, well, is this not a crisis? It is quite serious. We're going to miss 1.5 degrees. That's a given almost at this point. July was the hottest year on average, I think, that humanity has ever witnessed on Earth. And, things look pretty grim. So is there a danger that by, I totally take the point on not wanting to cause anxiety and make people feel hopeless and stuff, but is there not a danger that we become complacent if we're not setting the parameters in that way? This is genuinely sort of existential stuff. And I just wondered as well, if I may, just a quick point, Amelia, just from the position of the Financial Times in particular, as you've said, you do serve such a influential audience. These are the policy elites that are going to make these decisions ultimately at the end of the day. And I know that, as with all publications, you have to be sensitive to your audience's kind of opinions and needs and stuff. But you also occupy such a privileged position in the sense that you have that opportunity to form their opinion. And that is something that the FT can do, and other organizations like the FT.
Thank you for the question. Actually, we rely a lot on Chatham House reports quite often in our reporting. So that's a good segue to me telling you that, yes, we seek to influence through our authority, I guess. And so it's sort of maintaining an authoritative voice. And to do that, it's really important to stick to the facts. And actually, the facts are bad and terrible enough without using the word crisis. You just say it was the hottest 3 months, and there'll be another report next week on September. This is the hottest period we know of in our time. That headline itself states the situation that we're in. So, I guess I use the Secretary General as an example at the UN, where he's ratcheting up the crisis language each time he speaks because he's so frustrated and upset. But it's not certain that that's having any effect. We use that language in the headline. Secretary General warns of global boiling, but it does not seem to communicate the authority that you would like that his office presents. So if it's enough to say, with the temperature has already warmed, and I add it to almost every story, the temperature is already warmed by 1.1 degrees, and we've got 1.5 coming.
I would tend to agree with that, and that we can report the impact on your lives very straightforward or very emotively without resorting to Chicken Little running around the sky is falling, which I think is borderline what the Secretary General is doing. And as we saw, it has kind of turned off some of the audience and has not had the impact that I think he probably wish it would. People tune it out now. The fact that we can report that he said that or Greta is calling it this, I think that's helpful. But it gives us a little bit more reliability and relatability if we can put it in context and just say, like, look, this is your future. You can call it a crisis or you can call it business as usual, but it's up to you.
He answered. We have time for more questions, otherwise I'm going to ask some more. Okay, well, maybe I will ask one more and you'll get it. There was one here, okay.
Hi all, thank you for being here. It's a great discussion. My name is Lily Mendonça. I'm an environment reporter with the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. I have a specific question to Emilia about the game. So you mentioned that the FT has a very niche audience and you're a print publication, traditional newsroom. I was just wondering if you could share a little bit more about the engagement that you got with the game. So I would love to hear about why did you decide to pursue this new format and how engaged your readers were with the game. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So in my previous role as a digital editor in America, I oversaw all of the digital output. And in fact, although we've got a niche print audience, our digital audience is by far the biggest. I think it's 70%, and it's paying subscriber audience. So you have to be pretty engaged in the first place. But we wanted to use all of, as I always say with my digital hat on, is you want to use all the tools at your disposal to tell the story, and there are different tools that can tell different kinds of stories. And this idea of a game was something that the climate reporter at the time, lead climate reporter Leslie Hook, she had also previously worked on something called the Uber game when I was in America, which was, you know, you imagine yourself as an Uber driver and all of the economics that are involved in that exercise and the regulations and so on. It was very successful and it won prizes. So that was one of the learnings, if you like, about our audience. It's had millions of plays. It's free, as I say. We promote it to our schools program. We have a schools program. If you belong to a tertiary institution and some secondary institutions, you have free access to the Financial Times through your institution. So it was also aimed at them. We were lucky that we had to search, we found a partner to help us with the coding, because that was quite a difficult thing to have coding resources. It took nearly 6 months to build this game. Several reporters, 2 editors, and most of our data visualization team were involved in it. I would urge you to play it. It's fun. It's actually, it encourages you to play it again, to try and make different choices.
Okay. Feel free to ask more questions. I want to ask you one question about something that maybe we haven't discussed here. When we were talking about like covering and finding ways of putting pressure on authorities, I feel that we're very often talking about mitigation. In other words, like how we can solve, like the problem of emissions, how we can make fossil fuels best or something like this. But how to cover adaptation? So maybe, I believe most of you know what adaptation means, but the fact is that as we have almost 1.5 warming, we have so much impacts as we have here in Greece or in Libya, and governments should work for to take people from the risky areas and so on. So how to cover adaptation, and like how to cover public policy to basically allow people to cope with what is coming?
I think that's something that climate correspondents are going to have to do increasingly going forward. My own reporting while I still cover climate change and the policies, more and more I'm looking at like, okay, it's hot. We have to deal with it. What does that mean for labor rights? And what does that mean for public policy on labor rights? How do we change that? How do we adapt? We need to start asking those questions both to raise the threat and the crisis of climate change, has been asked earlier, but we also have to start being clear-eyed about what our future holds. It's never going to cool down. So we have to ask the question, what does a world where we have more wildfires look like? What do we start doing about firefighter training? What do we do about flood mitigation? Like, these are the questions that are the most essential now in climate reporting, I think.
Yeah, no, Aaron's totally right, but I guess one of the risks of writing about adaptation is a sort of idea of acceptance of global warming, and so that's the difficulty. I think we find in our reporting that many parts of the world are still at the stage where we send a reporter to Florida to cover a hurricane, and they interview people in a trailer park. Their trailer has been blown away for the third or the fourth time, but they don't ascribe that to climate change. They don't mention it. I've asked the reporter, did they mention climate change? And he said no, and I didn't bring it up because I didn't want to, coach them into an answer. So that, to me, we're still sort of grappling with that sort of fundamental problem, but it will shift very quickly to the how are you coping? Do we rebuild? Do you take towns and put them somewhere else? How do you do that? What's the cost of that kind of thing? But as I say, this is sort of difficult area because, in fact, I think Chatham House has had a report about exactly this issue of 1.5 degrees. Do you hang on to the idea of 1.5 degrees as a limit? You know, we use that as a really a very strict temperature limit now and a goal. If you let go of that, what does that mean? And most scientists are not recommending that because you just have this backsliding and then nothing is ever done about the root of the problem because you just put the fire out by putting more planes in the sky.
Well, one quick comment that if I may, that I found very interesting when we had the big fires in Hawaii. It was the very good coverage of the American press of the early warning systems, and was not mentioning climate change or anything, but being very specific why the early warning systems failed in Hawaii, and went deep on every kind of questions from what device people have, or the fact that people doesn't consume news more via TV and radio, and how this affect their survival. So these kind of stories might be more necessary looking forward. One question here and one more here. Just one. We'll have time for the two.
Hi, thank you for that. Eliza from CNN. I just wanted to ask you, Amelia, about what you've just said, which has now completely escaped my mind. You were just talking about...
Acceptance of the problem, or...
Yes, yes. And I was wondering about whether or not, you were talking about people in trailer parks naming the problem. And so often I have imagined that climate change is a bit like AIDS, and that people die of associated causes, and and not the thing itself. And how much does it matter that characters and stories, people living in places, use the words "it was climate change" to, because of course a lot of people push back on, oh, this is just cyclical, because people aren't able to say it was climate change, right? But they're saying we have less and less water or whatever. So I wondered how much that matters, that, climate change is the cumulative impact of lots of different types of effects that people are going to feel. And then perhaps for all of you, what do you think about the use of speculative writing? I can imagine from your newsrooms that might not be something that is entertained very often, but helping people imagine what does a future where we stop warming, or we address climate change. There've been experiments, particularly in smaller newsrooms or independent newsrooms, around the use of speculative writing to help, blending, I guess, fact and examples, and some kind of questioning, casting your eyes forward, and not just kind of describing today, which leads to sort of dystopian ideas.
And I'll do those in reverse. So in terms of the speculative writing, so we have a lot of columnists who come at the subject from a lot of different perspectives. So it would be the preserve of them, but also in our magazine we quite often will, Kim Stanley Robinson, where we'll get authors from outside to I guess he was imagining a future. He's written a book, of course. Unfortunately, it is quite a dystopian book. But that's that preserve. It's quite separate from our reporting, obviously, our daily, and which is what I'm in charge of. In terms of attribution of climate change and how important that is, I think it is important to attribute climate change, and I think it's important that in democratic terms, if governments and policymakers are going to act, it has to be driven by the needs of the population. And so if the population is in denial about that in some way, then that's problematic. I mean, most recently we saw in Libya, in our reporting we're quite careful to quote the scientists and say it's too soon to tell, but Libya is an example of where there's a lot of discussion about, was it just the construction of the dams that was the problem and the terrible government? And of course that leads to greater fatalities. You know, in places where you're least able to cope with the consequences of climate change is where you have the greater death rates. You know, I guess one of the statistics is that even as climate change is increasing, fewer and fewer people are dying. And the reason for that is because rich countries, when they are affected, are able to cope with that. You know, they're able to send people in to rescue, so on. But you don't have that in poorer countries, which is why early warning systems have become a thing, you know, to stop the death rate. It doesn't stop the disaster rate. So that's why that distinction is important. So, and back to the science, which is where I always land. You know, there is a group of scientists called the World Weather Attribution Network, and they are very important. They're doing very good work. And it may take 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, but never more than that when they deliver the science about what impact climate change had on a weather event. Is it just another weather event? Is it just sort of in an extreme range? You know, what we refer to in our reporting as unusually warm or unseasonably warm as opposed to extreme. And so, you know, we just follow the science as we're reporting on these things. And we make it quite clear, you know, this is what scientists think will happen. Other scientists might differ. Just like any science paper in a Nature journal or a science journal that's peer-reviewed, that's the approach that we take in digging into the nature of the change of climate versus weather.
Yeah, unfortunately, we are at the time. I won't be able to take another question, but Erin, do you have any final comments? You're good? Okay. Thank you very much. Sorry for not taking the final question. And I'll see you around. By the way, we have a very interesting panel tomorrow, continuing the discussion, looking at the other aspect, which is about rainforests, doing a little bit of propaganda. Two colleagues of mine will present about their work and investigations on rainforests tomorrow morning. Thank you.